Hello and welcome to this introductory React tutorial aimed at anyone new to React development. So this is part 2 of the React series. In the first tutorial, we developed a simple to-do list using class-based functions. Since React was first introduced, class-based components have been used to create React components. We then saw the introduction of hook or function-based approaches, which is now considered by some as preferable. So there are lots of tutorials online using both class and functions, so it is good to know the principles of using functions and how to convert between class and function-based components. So what to expect from this tutorial? So I will go through the installation again, that won't take very long if you've not seen the first tutorial. And then we go through the process of understanding some of the basic concepts of React using functions, and then move into building a to-do list application. So the main focus isn't building the application and building some of the components for that application. The main focus here is the underpinning knowledge, understanding some of the basics of utilizing React and the comparison between class-based and hook function-based components. So hopefully by the end of this tutorial, we'll have a general idea of maybe how to convert class-based components to function-based components and some of the basic principles of building a React application. So in this tutorial, I will be utilizing a Windows-based operating system, but if you're using Linux or Mac, you should still be able to follow this guide. So first of all, you'll need a copy, or you'll need to download and install NodeJS. So head over to the NodeJS website, download and install. It's a simple process. Keep pressing next and it will install absolutely fine. So there's a few tools that we're going to need from Node. It's not massively important that we understand why we need it at this point. I'll go through that or point out some of those things that we need as we go through the tutorial. But that's going to be mandatory to get this tutorial started. So once you've done that, we'll now head over to the code editor. So here I'm going to be utilizing Visual Studio Code. So again, you can utilize any code editor that you want for this tutorial. So if you're not familiar with code editors, then it doesn't really matter. Just download Visual Studio Code. It should be available on your operating system and get it started. And then we can start the project. All right, so assuming you've got your code editor now installed and ready to go, we can now just create a new folder or project folder. So I've made a new folder here in my C drive called React Functions To Do. So I've gone into there. I'm going to copy this link here, go back into my code editor, and then just go to File, Open Folder, and then paste that in, select that folder. There we go. So now inside that folder, we can now start building. Okay, so let's start a new project. So if you haven't already looked over some of the React tutorial material, there are some good material there. So we're going to follow this guide here. So reactjs.org docs create a new React app.html. So if you come down here, it says create a React app. So what we're going to need to do is utilize npx. So we installed NodeJS because it came with Node Package Manager and also npx. A way of installing applications and dependencies. So here we're going to run this command right here. So npx create React app. So I'm just going to copy that and then go back into my code editor and open up my terminal. If you don't have Visual Studio Code, just open up a command prompt. So just make sure you're in the right folder, and I'm going to run that command npx create React app. So this command here is going to actually start a new application. I need to give the application a name. So I'm just going to call this to do. So that's going to start a new React application called to do. Okay, so once you've finished, if I just type in dir, that's going to show me the folder. You can see I've now got a new folder in my folder. If I go back to the folder there. So inside of that is going to be the React application. So that's what we've just generated or just created. So first of all, I just need to cd into that, cd to do. So I'm in the right folder, and you can see here it's given us some instructions in the terminal. So npm starts the development server. So we're able to start a basic lightweight development server to run our application on our machine. So let's do that. Again, we're going to type in npm start to do that. So npm start. So that'll take a couple of seconds to run, and you can see that it opens up a new browser tab. And once it's finished loading, you should be presented with a screen that looks similar to this. So it does change slightly, the starter app. So it might not be exactly this, but this just tells us that our application is working. So if I go back into the folder now to do, we now have a few more different folders here. So I'll quickly go through that. So very quickly then, we've got node modules. So here in our application, we might want to extend our application or add functionality, and we can do that by downloading small snippets of code, modules, components. So those will get installed into here, and what we can then do is call them from our main application and utilize them within our application. So that can be a very popular way of extending or adding functionality to our application. So in addition to that, we have a public folder. So our application is being served from this file here, the index page. So what you just saw here, this is actually starting or being served from this index page here. And what you're going to find is that the rest of the application will be injected onto this page right here. So it gives you some information here which you can read through. So that's going to be the main HTML page, or the root page, or the wrapper around our application. And we can edit, we can go ahead and edit this, but we don't need to at this point. There are some images here that you saw on screen here. So that's what that represents right there. So the public folder, we can use the public folder for images, or maybe other resources we want to include in our application, the public folder. And then we have the SRC, source folder. So in here is our application. This is where we're going to predominantly be working from and building our application. Okay, so let's just slim down some of these files. So we're not going to need app CSS. We're not going to be doing any testing, so we'll get rid of that. So what we're going to leave essentially in this SRC folder is an app.js and an index.js file. We'll keep the service worker for now. Okay, so we'll delete that. We'll delete that. And the setup tests. Okay, so let's just slim it down like that. In the public here, we can remove these files if we wanted to. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so here we have an index page, and then we have the app page. So you can see from the app page, it looks fairly similar, or would represent what's on this page. And you can see now by deleting some of these resources, there's a problem. So let's go back into our code, and we'll just delete everything here apart from this outer element. I'm just going to say hi. Notice that it's a different shade here, which represents it cannot find the resource, or the resource isn't being utilized. So let's just get rid of that. I press save. There's no file called app.css anymore, so I'll get rid of that. So I then go into index, and I've got rid of this import index CSS, so I don't need that. And there we have it. So if we go back now, remember I typed in hi, we now have the word hi. So hopefully you can see the direct correlation between this app page and what's being displayed on the screen. So essentially what's happening here is this function here is being exported into the project, and it's basically returning this piece of HTML here, div class name app, and that's essentially what's being then displayed on the screen. So our index.js file typically handles our app startup, routing, and any other functions of our application that does require other modules to add functionality. So let's think of the index.js file here as the glue for the rest of our application. Our app here is a component. So we know it's a component because generally in React we add components into our application and we give them capital letters. So here we can identify it's a component because it's utilizing a capital letter. So I want to go out and stretch it a little bit further and think of a flow or a pattern here. We've got the index HTML page here that's served onto the web page. That basically incorporates what's in the index page. This index page is the glue. This handles the application startup and puts everything together, including any components. And the only component we have at the moment is app. So think of that as like the hierarchical chart, or think of that as the process that's happening at the moment. Now, it's not exactly what's happening, but it does give us a good start to scaffold into understanding what's happening here in React. So let's now focus on our component here and build this out. So let's first look at a boilerplate for creating a component. On the left-hand side is a class-based component that we completed in the first tutorial. So if you haven't seen the first tutorial, it's worth going over that tutorial first before you start this potentially. And then in the second screen here on the right-hand side, we have a function-based component. And you'll notice straight away, just by looking at it, that there's less code that we have to write to do essentially the same thing. The functionality is the same. So in our boilerplate, in our function here, we're going to import React first, and then we're going to, in the function side, we're going to create the function. Now we could put the export like it is in line 3. We could put the export up here. We've just put it at the bottom here. So we define in the left-hand side the class. The class is called app. And on the right-hand side, we're just using a function. So we just say function app. So in this section here, we add some of the functionality of our class or our function. And then we return things or items, attributes, code, HTML to the page. So the return is for adding, for example, a div or text, items we want to display on the page or return within our application. So the main difference here is that on the left-hand side in class, we're using render, and the right-hand side in the function, we use return. But I think the important thing here is that you can see that functions potentially initially use less code. Okay, so let's have a look at the app.js file again. So I'm back in the app.js file. I've just copied and pasted the boilerplate for our component. So here we have the importing React. So we'd make React available within this component, and then we create a new function. So let's just go ahead and use a return. So we're just going to set out a simple div. So it's important here that we have a containing div here or element. So if I were to, for example, have 2 elements, then it simply wouldn't work. It needs to be contained. So let's go ahead and just type something here. First app. So I press save. Just make sure that the terminal, our server is still working. Yep. Okay. So the server's still on. If you want to stop the server, press Control and C, and you can press Y and press up, and then start the server again. So that's how you can kind of control that. So let's just remove that. So you can now see that we have first app. So that's the first stage. We've got some text now working on our application. So now let's have a look at some dynamic text. Okay, so now let's have a look at state objects, essentially variables that's holding data that we might utilize within our application. So on the right hand side here is an example of how you would declare a new state, a new variable for your application using class-based components. You can see that we've got 7 lines here of code. So the equivalent here on the left-hand side, well, it's just 2 lines of code. Here you can see we're setting up essentially a variable here called username, and we're placing a default value of name1 within it. Exactly the same as what we're doing over here on the right-hand side using class-based components. So that's essentially the difference here. Notice again that there's less code. So just to reiterate in basic terms, here we've set up a variable called username, and we're just defining a value inside of it called name1. So that's what's now stored in this essentially a variable. Now we can't edit this variable directly. Therefore, we set up this secondary name here, set username, and that's going to allow us to actually change the state of this username. So if we wanted to change this from if we wanted to change what's stored in here, which is currently name1 to something else, we'd need to do it through set username. Okay, that's important to understand, but we'll go through that shortly. Okay, so there we've set up essentially a variable with name1 inside of it, and we can now use that within our application. So using class-based components, we'd probably use something like this. So we'd have to say this.state.username to get to the data within our component. So we don't need to do that here. We're just simply going to say, well, username. That's it. So this is just in the curly braces. This is basically saying put whatever's stored in here right here. So what's currently stored is the word name1. So if I now save that and go back into my browser, you can see it now says name1. So it's just outputting what's inside of that variable, I'm going to call it. Okay. So hopefully you can see what's happening there. That's all very simple. So let's just extend this slightly. Like I did in the first tutorial, I added a very simple button, created a simple function that basically changed the data that's inside of this variable here. So let's do that with this example. So let's go ahead and first we're going to create a button, and then we're going to create a function that basically changes as we click the button. Okay, so first up the button, you can see that I've created a button and I'm using class name. So here incorporates Bootstrap, which we haven't done just yet. So I'm just going to remove that for now. So here we're going to create a button and on click. So I'm going to give it an action on click. We're going to change state data. So this is going to be calling a function. So essentially here we create a button with the name inside of it called change name. And we're going to create a function, an on-click function, so that when someone clicks on it, it's basically going to run this function here that we're going to build next called change state data. So I add a new function inside of our application here. So function, and I name it to change state data to match up what's in our button here. So notice the pattern here. I've got curly braces. And inside of here, I'm going to type a ternary operation. So set username. So username, if the username is equal to Xander, so I'm going to change this now to Xander. So the default now is going to be Xander. Then it's going to change. So if username is equal to Xander, then it's going to basically change it to not Xander. So now the username will equal not Xander. So if it doesn't equal Xander, so if what's stored in here doesn't equal Xander, then it's going to change it to Xander. So what's now stored is the word Xander in here. Now notice that in order to set that information inside of here, I'm using the set username, which is this function, or so this here. So this is going to allow me to actually set the function, or to allow me to set the variable or the data inside of username. Okay, so now we've got that in place. So every time I click here, it's basically going to see if it's called Xander or not. If what's inside of here is Xander, then it's going to change to not Xander. Then if what's inside of here is not Xander, it's going to change to Xander. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's go ahead and click this button. So obviously what we need to do is go back here, and then we want to output username. So we'll do that right there. So that's going to output the username. So now when I do this, you can see it's changing from Xander to not Xander. So that's just a simple example there of using a function here to perform an operation, changing the data here in our state. Okay. So some examples that you might see, they don't use the word function, So you can declare a function with a function keyword or as a function expression. So for example, if I remove this and add this here, so here you can see I'm using the change state data still, but instead of that, I've now changed this into a function expression. So in JavaScript terms, we could call this an arrow function. You can see that our program works exactly the same. So either way, you can work utilizing this arrow function or using the function keyword. Now, if you look online, some prefer using one way and some prefer the other. I think the utilizing function actually uses less characters, and over a large project that could mount up significantly. So whatever you feel comfortable, I'll use both just to show you some examples in this project. Before we start building the to-do list application, let's first install Bootstrap. So I'm just going to stop the server and type in npm install Bootstrap. So this is going to install Bootstrap, a CSS framework, just to provide some styling for our application. So once you've done that, head over to the index.js file and import the CSS from Bootstrap. So that should now be available within the whole project. So with that said, we can now go over to the application and our button, where we had no class name before, I've added button primary, which are two Bootstrap classes. And what that's going to do is just add some styling to our button there. That just checks to make sure that our Bootstrap implementation has worked, and it is. So now we can go ahead and continue with our application. So to show items in our to-do list, I'm just going to add some data, some default data that we can add in our to-do list. So I do that by, again, just recreating what we built earlier. So here I'm going to create a new container or data container to do items. And then so that we can set that data in there, we've got set tools. So inside of here, I've got 3 items in my to-do list. I've got an action and a done. And I have added true there just so we can see some differences. So the action or the to-do list item is going to be buy milk. And then you can see that this has actually been done and so on. So now we now have some data for our application. So what we want to do now is list this out within our to-do list. So let's go ahead and just add some new data or some new components in our return. So we're going to have some sort of header. So utilizing Bootstrap, I'm just going to build a container. And in here, I'm going to add a col12. So this is essentially just saying that I want to use 12 columns. So it's going to stretch the whole width of the screen here. And then I'm going to use this h2 here. So inside of this h2 is going to be some text. So that text is going to be the username inside of this username up here that we're storing, and then to-do list. So if I press save there, so we've created a new element, press refresh. Okay, so we're going to need to start the application if you haven't already started the application. So if you remember npm start. So we set that up. I'll just close those. So you can now see I've got this nice little nav bar or menu bar at the top. So next up we need to output the list of items. So let's go back into our application. So let's just get rid of the button. We don't need that anymore. So it's just left with our outer container and then our menu or our navigation bar. And so under here, we're going to now add a list to list out all of these items. So I'm going to use a table to do this. So just let's make a new container for this, a full width container. And then we're going to use a table. So this is a straightforward HTML table. So I'm going to add some columns. So I've got 2 columns here, task and complete, for my action and done. And then these 2 columns are going to be populated. So they're going to be populated by this information. So what I want to do is loop through this information and output it into the into the rows of my table. So here I'm using map. So this map method creates a new array populated with the results of, in this case, our data up here. So essentially what we're doing here using map is we're going to loop through this data. Every time we loop through this data, we're going to output it as a new row. So we want to here include to do and index. So basically for each piece of information that we kind of loop through, that piece of information is going to reside in to do. So we've got 3 items here. So every time essentially this loops through, that first piece of information is going to be there. So we're also going to include an index. So we can do lots of things later, but essentially what's happening here is that this is going to be 0, this is going to be 1, this is going to be 2. Okay, so we're going to include an index as we output this data. So we then set out what data we want to include. So here we've got a key that's going to be index. So our key is going to be 0 in the first iteration, 1 in the second iteration, and so on. And then I've called out index equals index, and then to do equals the to do data. So what we got here is a call to a function. So we're going to call a function and include all the code that's going to be here, but we're going to send, or we're going to make available this to do information and then add it to some HTML and replace it right here. Okay, so using an arrow function, we're going to set up this to do arrow function. Notice we're passing data. So every time this loops around, we're passing in this to do data right here into this function. And what we're going to do is just output some HTML. So we want to kind of return the TRs, so a new row, and then TDs are cells. So in this cell, in this first cell, we're going to have to do and then the action. So what's happening here is that we're going to grab this piece of information as we iterate, first piece of information. So we've got action and done. So that's defining the property and value. So we're going to get the action. So to do, get this piece of information and then get the action piece of information. So the action piece of information is going to say buy milk. So this is going to now say buy milk on the first iterations. On the second iteration, it's going to say dentist and so on. So we then add a new row for our second complete row. So here, apologies, I'm scrolling a lot. So our second row, you can see it, we're going to have an input, a checkbox input, and we're going to check to see if it's done or not. So if it is done, then if done equals true, then this is going to be checked. If done equals false, then, well, this checkbox isn't going to be checked. So we'll see that in a second. So we've got that in place now. Apologies, I'm jumping around here. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me just reiterate one more time. You can skip it, but let me just reiterate one more time what's happening. So here we're using a map method, which essentially creates a new array populated with the results that we're calling. So we're calling this data to do items right here, which is all this data here. Now there's 3 items here. So we're going to loop through each one. As we loop through each one, the data gets prepared here. We then call this function and we put the data into this, what is a template. And this template then gets outputted onto the screen. Then it loops through and iterates to the next item and does exactly the same thing. And that data then ends up in this kind of template and outputs to the screen and so on. So it's going to do that for all 3. So what we should now have on the screen is our list like this. And you notice that this was set to true, so it is now ticked, and these aren't ticked because they were set to false. So there we go. So that's how to output the data there. So next up, we're going to add items to our list here. So we're going to do that by having an input at the top here with a button. So what's going to happen here is that when someone inputs some data, that data is going to be saved. And then when we press the button, that saved data is then going to be added to the existing list of to-do list items. So the first thing we need to do is create a data store for this new information. So I'm going to call this new to-do. So we create a new state there called to-do. Right, so next thing is we now need to add some of the HTML functionality. So we're going to need an input and a button. So I've gone ahead and created a new element here, co12 again. And we've got a simple input here. I'm using class name form control. And then the button and button primary from Bootstrap, and with the word add. So if we go back now, it should look a bit like this. So here we're going to type some stuff, press add, and it's going to be added to the list. So what we're going to do is in the input, just add the on change and then reference a function called update value. So every time someone types a letter, into the input field, it's going to automatically save here. So what we do need to do now is just add a new function so we can achieve that. Okay, so to capture the data from the user, let's go ahead and create this function, so update value. And we're going to use event or pass an event. So we're going to be able to capture the information that someone's typed into the input. And then what we want to do is, well, if we want to change the state here, we need to use add new to do. And then we basically say event. So go into the event data, look for the target and then the value. And there we go. So that's how to get that information from someone's typed in to the actual state here, new to do. So we can test to see if that is working by going into the browser and then type something in. So here what I have in Chrome is the React developer tools. So go ahead and download those tools for Chrome. And if I now just open up F12 and I can now have a look, if I go into components, into my app, I can have a look in the state. So you can see here that this state here is ASDF. And if I change this, you can see that it's changing. So essentially what's happened there is that, like I said, every time we type something, it's changing the state. That's what we've just made. And now what I need to do is press add. So when I press add, it's going to take the information from this state here, this data, and it's going to now add it to the list of items. So that's what we now are going to achieve. So first of all, let's head over to the button. We want to now add a on click. So this is the button. So I add on click and new to do items. So this is going to be a new function that we're going to create that actually takes the data from our state new to do state here and then adds it to our list. So let's build a function. We're going to call this new to do item. So that's what we're calling here from our button. And then here we're going to use a spread operator. So we use set to do. So that's what we need to call in order to set data. Go back up here. So we're adding data here. So we need set to do to set or add some new data. And then we're using this spread operator. So basically we're taking all the information here. And then what we're doing is we're adding a new line at the end. Action is going to be new to do. So new to do is referring to the data here, this data right here, new to do. So whatever someone's typed in, remember. And then by default, done equals false. So there we go. So we're just going to run that. That's going to add the new data to our list here. And we'll then be able to see it on the page. So let's go ahead and have a look. So now when we add a new item, press add, we now have a new item and it is currently false. So you will notice that if I refresh the page, it will disappear. So I don't go as far as thinking about how we can store that permanently. This is just an example in this tutorial, but if you wanted to set that, we could utilize maybe the browser storage, for example, to set that. So, or alternatively a database, for example. So let's go ahead and now think about setting complete from true to false. At the moment, we can't do that. So what we need to do is head back over here to on line 21. We've got the input, so this is the checkbox input. At the moment, we're sending or we're using the data to check whether they're true or false. If they are true, it's ticked. If it's false, it's not ticked. So what we need to do now is set another on change. So basically, when someone clicks it, a change has happened. So on change, we want something to happen. So what we can do here is add an on change. If I can just get out of that. So what we're going to do is add a new function called toggle done, and we're going to pass the data that's being sent into this function to do, and we can now pass that data over to this new function. So we pass that data in, and now we're going to build a new function called toggle done. So first of all, let's just build a new function. It's called toggle done, and we're sending the data to do into this. Now we're just calling this to do also, so we can now access this information within this function from to do. Okay, so next up, what we want to do is, again, we're going to utilize a map. So we're going to cycle through all these different items here, and then we're going to make a match. So what we want to do is, let's just go back into, we can't. So what we want to do is, if you remember on the screen, you're going to have a button. We need to identify which to-do list item has been clicked. So first of all, we're going to say item action. So as we cycle through the items, we're going to say where the item action is equal to do action. So we're just going to match up. So when someone clicks on a to-do list item, that will have an action name. And basically what we're doing, we're matching that action name to an item in the list. So when there is a match, we know, for example, we're going to be working on this one or this item. So once we've captured that, we can now change that item. So what we're doing here essentially is now just simply changing the done. So not item done. So we're just going to use the opposite. So if it's true, it's going to change to false. And if it's false, it's going to change to true. So that's what we're doing there. So we're essentially basically just making a match, finding the item from the list, and then checking to see if done is true or false, and then swapping it from true to false or false to true. So the last thing to do is just to set the information, because we've sorted out whether the item is done or not. So that new information now needs to be set. So we run the set to do up here. So we run set to do to add the new information to the do items, and that information we want to set is what we've just sorted out here. So now we should have the ability to click the items. Okay, so once we've done that, notice that when we add new items, this still remains. So let's just quickly remove that. So first of all, let's just go ahead and blank out or remove all the items that would be stored in the new to do. So remember, when someone types into the input field, something into the input field, it adds to new to do. So what we want to do is use add new to do to remove all the items there. So we add the item to our list and then we blank it out. So if we move down a little bit further, that won't work on its own, because what we need to do in this input field, we need this to equal whatever's in that data store. So let's go ahead and just add a value here. So input the value equals and our new to do. So this input field is always going to the value or whatever's currently inside of this input field is always going to represent whatever's stored in this new to do. So let's just refresh. I don't need to do that, but let's add that. So when I press add now, the data gets removed from the store, and obviously the value now represents nothing. So that just adds that functionality. So let's just finish this off by adding a feature, a new column here to delete items. So we'll just start off by, let's go into the table. It's getting a bit messy now, but let's go into the table here. Let's add a new column here called delete. So that's our new column in place. So what we need to do now is go up here. This is where it's all formed here. So we need a new set of TDs right here. So this is going to be a new column. And in here we're going to place a button. So this button is just a standard button, and I've got an on-click function here. So when someone clicks on it, it's going to remove one of my items or the item that it's referring to. So what I'm going to do is set up a new function here called remove to do, but I'm going to pass into that the index. So this was important and why we captured the index, because what's happening here is that we're capturing the index of the item so that we know what item to delete. So remember down here, so we're capturing the index. So as we loop through, we're adding the index. So the index is basically, as it loops through, which iteration it's on. So this is going to be 0, this is going to be index 1, this is going to be index 2. So by capturing 0, 1, or 2, I can now work out which one to delete from the list here. So this is why we're passing an index into this function. So let's now build this function. So first of all, we create it. So remove to do, and we're going to pass in the data, the index data. So we then basically loop through all the items and just put it into this new variable, new to do. So we're going to store all the items. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that data and we're going to use splice. And basically where the index number represents the index number of our list, we're basically going to remove it from our list here. And then we're going to then use set to do again. And we're going to take all that data and just set it into our new to-dos. So basically what we do here in principle is that we've listed this out and we've got an index for this. So 0, 1, and 2. We then work out which one we need to delete, index 0, 1, or 2. And then basically we're using splice here, we've just deleted the appropriate one. So once we've deleted it, we then put all that data and prepare it, and then we set it again inside of this state. So now we can go ahead and test. You can see here that if I refresh, obviously it goes back to the original state. I can press delete, and then I can add items and I can delete them and I can set them as done. So essentially what we've done here in React is we've gone through CRUD, create, return, update, and delete using function-based components. So I did swear away and I haven't really given you any comparison other than at the start in terms of using class versus functions. Most of that was, like I said, at the start of a tutorial. So by all means, go over the first tutorial and compare the code to get familiar with both class-based and function-based components. Okay, so there we have it, a short introduction to function-based components in React, an introduction to React and utilizing function-based components and looking at data. Like I said, we've gone through CRUD, so create, return, update, and delete. So hopefully I've given you some good information, useful information, which you can now go ahead and expand upon.